ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for standing by. Welcome to the How to Avoid the 5 Most Common FLSA Mistakes webinar. Please note that during the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, simply use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Wednesday, March 18th, 2015. You'll also receive a copy of the slides this Friday via email, so you have all the information that's presented today at your fingertips. My name is Stephanie Thomas, and I am your host on behalf of HR Direct. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I am pleased to introduce you to our speaker, Allison Green, author of the popular blog, Ask a Manager. I'll now turn it over to you, Allison. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and hi everyone. I am Allison Green. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on who I am before we launch in. Let's see here. I seem to be having some trouble making these slides move. There we go. Okay, hopefully that's going to be our only technical issue today. So I am the former Chief of Staff for a nonprofit organization where I oversaw the day-to-day running of the organization. I have a website called Ask a Manager where I answer readers' questions on job search and career advice issues, management. I do the same thing over at U.S. News and World Report as well as Inc. magazine. And I co-authored a book a couple of years ago on nonprofit management. I really love talking about our topic today, which is maybe a strange thing to love, but I do. So let's launch in and get started here. Let's see. Are these slides working? There we go. So today we're going to focus on the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is often referred to as the Wage and Hour or Time and Pay Law. It affects nearly every business in the United States. It should come as no surprise to you that the FLSA is a complicated law, and it covers everything from minimum wage and overtime pay to record keeping and child labor standards. And because it's so comprehensive, many employers make some mistakes along the way. In fact, FLSA violations are at an all-time high right now, with the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor stepping up investigations and enforcement to deal with the problem. And actually since 2009, the Department of Labor has closed over 145,000 cases nationwide, resulting in more than $1 billion in back wages for over 250,000 workers. So in this day and age, you really can't afford to take chances. Today's webinar is going to help you steer clear of the biggest oversights with the FLSA. Now, as you might have figured out, I am not a lawyer, but HR departments do typically have to deal with FLSA violations too. HR is in charge of record keeping. We're the ones who handle employee complaints, and I'm sure that you know that pay and record keeping are 2 big employee complaints. In fact, a lot of the Ask a Manager readership comes from employees, and an awful lot of their questions are about pay practices and overtime, so it's a topic I'm well versed in. So while I may not be a lawyer, I do have a lot of experience with the topic, and I can explain it to you without all the legalese that you might get from a lawyer's point of view as opposed to a manager's point of view. Since today's webinar is about avoiding the most common FLSA mistakes, I'd like to start things off with a poll to see what you're the least comfortable with. The FLSA is a law that frequently trips up employers, especially when it comes to employee exemptions and recording payable hours. And you may be confused about certain aspects of the FLSA or worry about doing something that would trigger an employee complaint, or worse, a knock on the door by a Department of Labor investigator. This webinar is going to help. So if you take a look at this poll, I'm going to give people a minute here to vote on which area of FLSA compliance you're the least comfortable with. For some people, it might be making sure that you're getting proper pay to employees, including things like overtime. It might be determining employee status correctly, which is something that we're going to talk a lot about today. It's something that really can trip people up. It might be counting off-the-clock work hours. Should you have them in the first place? If you do you need to count them? How do you count them? It might be appropriate record keeping. So go ahead and enter your vote in right here. We're just going to give people a minute to get their votes registered, and then we'll take a look at what the results are. One thing that I hear a lot from about the employee side is that employees are really confused about this kind of thing too. They're sort of looking to their employer for guidance. Employers aren't always giving really clear guidance about it. It's an area that is really shrouded in confusion and misinformation for people. So I'm interested to get a look at what the poll results are and see what's most on the mind of our audience here today. I'll give people just a little bit longer to get your votes in. Looks like we've got poll results in now, and the clear winner by a pretty significant margin is determining employee status. So that's definitely something we're going to spend some time on today, hopefully clear up confusion. And in the second place, we've got appropriate record keeping, followed by counting off-the-clock work hours and how that all works, and followed by proper pay, including overtime. So it looks like all four of these represent significant areas of confusion for people, so we're definitely going to cover all four of these today and hopefully clear some of these topics up and make sure that you get answers to whatever questions you have. So the top 5 mistakes that we'll explore in this webinar are, first of all, 1, wrongly classifying an hourly employee as exempt. 2, docking the overtime hours that employees have rightfully earned. 3, forcing or encouraging off-the-clock work. 4, not counting all hours worked for things like travel or changing clothes, training. And then last, 5, incomplete or inaccurate record keeping, which is really an important part of the FLSA. And you'll find there's some overlap between the 5 topics, but they'll each get their own section in this webinar. And while talking about the FLSA sticking points for employers, I'll also share a handful of best practices for staying in compliance and out of harm's way. They'll be practical, everyday pointers that make sense for most any employer. And remember, it only takes one employee complaint to trigger a Department of Labor investigation, so you really can't be too careful. It's better to have the facts cover all the bases. Speaking of which, since the FLSA is a very comprehensive law with a lot of ins and outs, I'm anticipating that you're going to have plenty of questions, and I definitely encourage you to ask them. We'll try to answer as many as we can. So let's get started. The sooner you know what the issues are, the sooner you can make the right changes to protect your business. Although I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, it's worth pointing out that the FLSA does establish the minimum wage. Currently, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, and tipped employees are paid $2.13 an hour. This year, the minimum wage also increased to $10.10 an hour for government contractors. This should go without saying, but it's absolutely critical to pay your employees at least the federal minimum wage, or if it's higher in your state or city, paying that amount. As of January 1st of this year, 29 states had a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum, so you really want to know what your state and local laws might be. There's only a few very specific exceptions to paying the minimum wage, such as workers with disabilities, full-time students, youth under 20 in their first 90 days of employment. But otherwise, employees need to be paid the minimum wage. Okay, now we're going to dig into the first and biggest mistake employers make with the FLSA, which probably no surprise was also the top result in our poll of things that people are unsure about, and that's misclassifying employees. So according to the Department of Labor, misclassification is the most common FLSA violation. Under the FLSA, all employees are classified as either exempt or non-exempt. Non-exempt employees are often referred to as hourly workers, although you can certainly have salaried workers who are non-exempt as well. As a general rule, non-exempt employees must receive at least the minimum wage for all hours worked, and they must receive overtime pay at 1.5 times their regular hourly rate for any hours over 40 that they work in a week. Now, exempt employees, on the other hand, they're usually paid a salary, and they're not legally entitled to overtime pay. And this is where employers get into trouble. Non-exempt employees receive overtime pay. Exempt employees do not. Less scrupulous employers may misclassify employees as exempt in order to avoid having to track their hours or pay them overtime. It's important to note here that hourly and salaried are not classifications. They're just methods of paying employees. You can have non-exempt salary employees, so how you pay your employees does not guarantee that they're exempt or non-exempt. Instead, the FLSA itself sets specific legal standards for considering someone exempt. This is really important. Whether or not someone is exempt is not up to the employer. The categorization comes from the federal government based on the person's job duties, and this is where employers really mess this up sometimes. First, there is the salary basis test, where exempt employees have to be paid a set amount each week, regardless of the quantity or quality of their work. Second, exempt employees must be paid a minimum weekly salary of $455, which comes to annually $23,660. And finally, exempt employees must fall under one of the highly specialized exemptions under the FLSA. And the most common exemptions, the ones that lead to the most disputes under the FLSA, are the executive, administrative, and professional exemptions. And these are often called white-collar exemptions. So executive employees must manage at least 2 employees and have firing and hiring authority. Administrative employees must do office work that's related to the management or policies of the business and make independent decisions on important matters. Professional employees must have responsibilities that require advanced work in the fields of science and learning. There's also other exemptions for outside sales employees and certain computer professionals as well. While we're talking about job duties and exemptions, let me remind you that job titles aren't always a good indicator of what a position entails. Sometimes companies will create job titles to imply that employees are technically exempt, even though the actual work that they're performing doesn't line up with that. And that's something that Department of Labor investigators are well aware of. Because of this, they'll always look beyond titles like manager or administrator to an employee's actual job duties to determine exempt status. So it's a smart practice to review job descriptions every year to make sure that they really do match the realities of the position. One more thing. Because it's been in the news lately, you should be aware that the current administration is working to revise the FLSA's overtime exemptions for the first time since 2004. A proposed rule is expected in the coming weeks that would narrow the class of workers who are considered overtime exempt by boosting the minimum salary amount and also tightening the duty requirements. Well, this could be a big deal for employers, so you want to keep an eye on this.
Allison, it's Stephanie here. We have a great question from Amy that I wanted to chime in and point out right now since you're moving off of the topic. Are blue-collar positions typically non-exempt, given you have white-collar exemptions?
So I don't want to give a blanket rule that applies across the board because there is no such blanket rule. Often blue-collar positions are likely to fall in the non-exempt category. But again, if it's a position that has significant management responsibility related to the running of the business, someone's making independent decisions on important business matters, they may very well be exempt. So the best thing that you can do actually is, well, the very best thing actually is to work with a lawyer who specializes in this, who can take a look at the specific positions that you have questions about and give you some advice. If that's not a feasible option, and especially if you're a smaller business, that can be harder to do, the Department of Labor actually has some great information on their website. They even have a piece where they'll walk you through asking questions about the position and point you in the right direction for what the categorization is likely to be. It's a little bit of a weird area of the law in that there's not just an easy formula that you can apply and have a quick answer that you're confident about. So you really do want to get yourself familiar with the guidance that they have on their website.
Allison, that sounds great. I do have another question for you that came in, and then we'll move right along. We don't want to hold anything up. But Paul asked, what is the best way to move someone who is misclassified without causing problems?
So if you have someone who's been misclassified as non-exempt and you want to move them to exempt, usually that's going to be pretty easy to do. I mean, that means that you have been paying them overtime when you didn't need to, and now you just need to correct that. So there's no issue of money that you might owe to them in back pay. If it's the other way around, and this is much more commonly where you see this question come up, is where you've been treating someone as exempt, not paying them overtime for hours worked over 40 in a week, realize, this person is actually in a role that should be being treated as non-exempt. We should have been paying them overtime. That is trickier. It's likely that you owe back pay, and that's where I would really bring in a lawyer to work with you and make sure that you've got all of your bases covered and that you're not going to be hit with down-the-road penalties for not setting up that back pay correctly.
That sounds good. I think we can move right along now.
Okay, great. So the second FLSA violation that we're going to talk about is overtime pay. The issue of properly classifying employees as exempt or non-exempt is directly related to this. As I've already mentioned, overtime is additional pay at 1.5 times the person's normal rate for any hours over 40 in a work week. Overtime must be paid to all non-exempt employees. It's completely non-negotiable. It seems simple, but the number of employers who break the overtime rules is actually pretty astonishing. This one issue keeps the Department of Labor very, very busy, and the list of companies that have paid the price for violating the rules is long. One big example, in 2012, after a Department of Labor investigation, the mega retailer Walmart agreed to pay $4.83 million in back wages and damages to employees who it had illegally denied overtime to. And more than 4,000 workers ended up receiving money from that settlement. And the Secretary of Labor even cautioned to let this case, quote, be a signal to other companies that when violations are found, the Labor Department will take appropriate action to ensure that workers receive the wages that they've earned. So if a company as big as Walmart can get this wrong, imagine how often it happens in other smaller companies across the U.S. The solution, obviously, is to classify employees properly, understand who's entitled to overtime pay, and pay them accordingly. Those are the do's. But beyond this, let me share some important don'ts with overtime pay. Don't allow comp time in lieu of overtime. This is something that I hear about a lot from people writing in when their employers are doing it and they're wondering if it's okay. Overtime pay is due for the week in which 40-plus hours are worked, and hours should never be carried over from one work week to another in order to avoid paying overtime. Don't calculate overtime on a pay period basis either. Even if your pay cycle is not weekly, you still must pay overtime based on the number of hours worked in a 7-day work week. Don't permit hourly employees to work off of the clock, even if they want to learn something new, catch up, or get ahead. If employees don't stick to their scheduled hours despite their rules, that's a discipline issue, but you still have to pay them for any extra time that they worked. By law, overtime cannot be waived in any circumstance. In other words, you can discipline someone for working unauthorized overtime, but you still have to pay them for the time. Also, don't dock pay or delete hours from a timesheet for unauthorized overtime. The law requires you to pay for all hours that someone works, including overtime pay, whether or not you okayed the person working those extra hours. And again, you can discipline or even fire employees if they work overtime that you didn't authorize, but you still have to pay them for the time worked.
Allison, a great question just came in that I want to pop in and mention from Claire. What is the best way to handle an employee taking overtime without permission?
Good question. So as a business owner or an HR manager, you should first talk with the employee's manager. And if the manager knew that the employee worked overtime without permission, why didn't he or she stop it? The FLSA does not stop you from implementing a policy that prohibits unauthorized work or for disciplining employees for violating that policy or for outright saying no to someone who wants to work additional hours. And again, this doesn't mean that you can withhold overtime pay, but you can talk to the employee about the situation, especially if it's a repeat situation. I'd use a written warning that says something like, despite our previous discussions instructing you not to work overtime without your supervisor's prior approval, you have again worked unauthorized overtime, which will be paid to you at the time and 1/2 rate. However, please understand that failure to obtain appropriate advance approval in the future may result in further disciplinary action up to and including dismissal. The idea here is that when employees understand that they can be fired for working overtime without authorization, and that you're really serious when you say that, they're really much less likely to keep doing it. All right, so let's move along here. One more don't before we move forward. Don't overlook the fact that if you pay commissions or contest awards, piece rates, or even non-discretionary bonuses to non-exempt employees, that has to be included in the base rate of pay being used to calculate overtime. So that is very complicated sounding. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you pay a $100 performance bonus on a 50-hour work week. You normally pay employees $10 an hour and therefore $15 an hour for overtime. That $100 bonus makes the employee's base wage $12 an hour for that particular pay period. And as a result, overtime for that period needs to become $18 an hour. Going back to off-the-clock work, I'd like to take a closer look at this third FLSA mistake now. So as supervisors and managers, we juggle a lot of responsibilities and really feel the pressure to make sure that all the work of the team, the department, or the business is getting done. But we also have to control payroll costs. As a result, we might be tempted to suggest that hourly employees work off the clock to handle the workload. And even though off-the-clock hours are all too common for many American workers, it's absolutely not allowed under the FLSA. It's actually illegal, and your business could face some serious consequences. FLSA lawsuits often include complaints that employees worked through lunch breaks, came in early or stayed late, all without pay. And as an employer, you really must pay non-exempt employees for all hours worked and prohibit them from working off the clock, whether it's taking work home, making or receiving job-related telephone calls at home, working before or after regular shifts, even volunteering to tie up loose ends while they're on vacation or on a day off. Those are all no-nos, and they can come back to haunt you, so you really want to be careful about that. Another thing, the widespread use of technology and electronic tools like smartphones and online email access will come into play here. Can you expect non-exempt employees to respond to voicemails or emails before or after their regularly scheduled shifts? Not without paying them for any time spent doing that, according to the FLSA. If you're going to allow employees to work remotely or to remain accessible outside their scheduled work hours, you've got to make sure that you're recording their time and paying them for it. Let's talk specifically about lunch breaks. To avoid any complications with 30-minute unpaid breaks, you want to be sure that employees are completely relieved of their work so they can take breaks uninterrupted. I know this is much easier if you're a larger workplace with a break room or a lunchroom or a cafeteria. It can be harder to police in smaller companies or offices where people tend to eat lunch at their desk or their workstation, but you still have to make it happen. You can encourage employees to leave the office in some way, even if it's just to take a walk. You can consider setting up picnic tables somewhere if you have the space. But if your employees stay at their desks while they eat, it's that much harder to ensure they're actually taking a break and they're not working through their lunches. Be careful, too, with automatic deductions. Now, some companies will have a timekeeping system that automatically deducts for 30-minute meal breaks. Automatic break deductions are allowed under the FLSA, and they can be helpful in busy fields like retail, restaurants, healthcare, but only when employees actually are taking that full unpaid break. When workers miss a break or a break is cut short because they need to come back and answer a phone call or address a work emergency, they've got to be paid for that time. So if you have a system that's automatically deducting breaks, you've got to have a mechanism for correcting in a situation like that. Remember, too, that automatic meal deductions can raise a red flag with the Department of Labor, because it's pretty unlikely that every employee eats at exactly the same time each day. So to keep a tight lid on this, I recommend an electronic tracking system or a cloud-based program like Hello Scheduling that lets you log the actual times clocked in or out. And these programs will also have a procedure for overriding automatic deductions for any situation where non-exempt employees do skip breaks or receive less than their full time. Also keep in mind, hourly employees should not be docked for breaks that are under 20 minutes. Short breaks are counted as working time, and they should be managed just based on whatever your company policy is. All right, how are we doing so far? I know we've covered a lot. There's two more items that I want to discuss today. The issue of uncounted hours, and then to bring everything together, the importance of proper record keeping. Well, it's relatively easy to track the hours that a non-employee puts in doing work. How do you handle time that's spent on work-related activities? Take putting on a uniform, for example, or another clothing change that's necessary for the job. Do you have to pay employees for the time spent doing this? Well, under the FLSA, if the clothing is, quote, integral and indispensable to the work, you do have to pay for the time spent changing into or out of clothing, or as the FLSA calls it, donning and doffing. There are a few more murky situations of countable and payable hours. Supervisors of non-exempt employees need to be familiar with these situations, which I'll go over right now. Commuting. So generally, if an employee is not paid for time spent commuting from home to a workplace, even if a company vehicle is being used, But there is an exception, which is if the employee stops on the way to work to pick up supplies or to pick up other employees. In that case, the second leg of the trip is working time and needs to be paid accordingly. Workday travel. Travel during the workday between work sites, so going from one store location to another store location, is considered working time and must be paid. Travel more generally. If employees travel during their regularly scheduled work hours, the travel time is payable. You also need to pay employees for all work time like setting up a booth or preparing for a trade show, no matter what time of day it is, no matter what day of the week it takes place. Training and meetings. Time spent in training and meetings is considered working time if attendance is required or if the event is directly related to the employee's job. Now remember this one, meal periods. You don't have to pay for meal breaks if they're at least 30 minutes and employees are completely relieved of their work duties. But otherwise, if the break is cut short or if employees are still working, even partially, you do need to pay for the time. And short breaks under 20 minutes are counted as working time. On-call time, this has to be counted as hours worked if the employee's activities are restricted. So for example, emergency response personnel, firefighters, EMTs, paramedics, who might receive several calls, might need to respond quickly while they're on call, they are considered working. Waiting time. This is an interesting one. Time spent waiting to work must be counted in many situations. So for example, if your company's computer system crashes and your employees are waiting around for the system to reboot, their waiting time is working time under the FLSA. It needs to be paid. Pre- and post-work activities. Time spent preparing for and winding down from work activities must be counted as hours worked if they're necessary to the job. Cleaning or repairing tools or equipment used in the job, changing into required clothes or gear stored at the workplace, and washing or showering if it's essential to the work, such as food preparation or handling chemicals, all needs to be counted as hours worked. One thing to keep in mind, these are guidelines for non-unionized workplaces. And if your workplace is unionized, the rules may be different, depending on any stipulations in your collective bargaining agreement.
Allison, I'm here to pop in with a great question from Tricia that I thought would be perfect timing. She asked, is there an exception for staff that are required to eat with or stay with clients? Going back to that meal breaks comment, if it was maybe you're in a healthcare position, you have to stay with your patients, what would you say about that?
That's a great question. So I am not 100% sure about this, and Tricia, you would want to check with an employer in your state who could give you advice specific to the nuance of what you're describing. But I will tell you that in general, if they're engaging in a required activity while they eat, that is work time and needs to be paid. So it sounds to me, based on very limited information, that you're talking about a situation where someone is still engaging in work and would need to be paid. Okay.
Thanks, Allison.
Sure. So let's see. Let's move on to incomplete or inaccurate record keeping. You did not think we would have a webinar about FLSA violations without talking about record keeping, did you? Record keeping, or more specifically incomplete or inaccurate records, is the fifth and final violation that can really trip up employers. So as with most major employment laws, companies need to keep careful records to create a legal paper trail and show that they're in compliance. And just to warn you, this information does get pretty detailed, so be sure that you check out the corresponding slides just to follow along. And we will be sending copies of the slides to you soon as well. So as a foundation, the FLSA requires you to keep records on each employee that include the employee's full name and social security number, address including zip code, birth date if they're younger than 19, sex and occupation, all additions to or deductions from the employee's wages, total wages paid each pay period, date of payment, and the pay period covered by the payment. Now for non-exempt employees, you'll also need to record the time and day of the week when the work week begins, hours worked each day, the total hours worked each work week, the basis on which the employee's wages are paid. So that just means something like $9 an hour or $425 a week or piecework. Their regular hourly pay rate, their total daily or weekly straight time earnings, meaning earnings before you get into overtime, and their total overtime earnings, if any, for the work week. Regarding the retention of records, although the FLSA does require some employment and earnings records to be kept only for 2 years, I suggest you keep anything related to payroll for at least 3 years. And the reason for that is that in some instances, the FLSA does allow wage recovery lawsuits to be filed for up to 3 years. So better safe than sorry with this. And keep in mind, too, that many of these records are covered by other record-keeping laws, so you might have to keep them for longer than required by the FLSA as well. Now let's talk about timekeeping. Basically, you have a few different options for tracking the hours that your non-exempt employees work. You can do it manually with a punch card or time clock, electronically, online with a cloud-based program like Hello Scheduling, or with any other reliable method. As long as your records are accurate, you can choose any system that works best for your business. But on the other hand, if your records are incomplete and an employee claims that he or she was not paid enough, you're going to have a tough time defending yourself. So you really want to make sure that you're paying attention to record keeping. And in addition to recording all of the time worked by the employee, taking into account everything we've gone over today, you should also follow these guidelines. Have employees review and sign their time cards before submitting them for processing. Don't allow employees to punch in or punch out for other employees. Buddy punching is a serious problem. Even from a non-FLSA standpoint, you don't want that happening. Never alter an employee's time record without having the employee sign it to authorize the change. Changes should only be made to correct errors with inaccurate time entries. And don't let employees work off the clock, even if they volunteered to do it, without recording the time as hours worked. And as a manager or supervisor, it's your job to clearly communicate what you expect in terms of work hours and overtime. If an employee puts in overtime hours without permission, you can treat it as a disciplinary matter, but you still have to pay for those hours worked. And while we're on the subject of timekeeping, let me share something that you might find interesting. I really see it as a sign of the times and how we're doing more with technology than ever before. The Department of Labor now offers a smartphone app that lets employees independently track the hours they're working and the wages that they're owed. Users can also add comments about their work hours. They can view daily, weekly, and monthly summaries. The takeaway from that, in my mind, is that employers need to be even more careful about FLSA time and payrolls. Instead of relying solely on the employer's records, workers can take matters into their own hands. And as the Secretary of Labor says, this app will help empower workers to understand and stand up for their rights when employers have denied their hard-earned pay. So to wrap everything up, let's review the key points. Your employees are either exempt or non-exempt. Classifying them properly is critical because non-exempt employees must receive overtime pay and exempt employees do not. You've got to look beyond the job title or the payment method and consider the actual work functions to determine FLSA classification. Hourly employees are entitled to at least the minimum wage for all hours worked, as well as overtime pay of time and a half for hours over 40 in a work week. Having employees work off the clock is illegal. Don't allow it, even if an employee volunteers to put in extra time. But don't dock pay if someone does work overtime without permission. Address the situation in another way. You must completely relieve employees of all duties during a 30-minute meal break so they can enjoy them without interruption. And be especially careful with automatic deductions that don't take into account when these unpaid breaks aren't taken or when they're cut short. And similarly, there are a handful of circumstances that must be counted as working hours for hourly employees, like travel, training sessions, and on-call time. And finally, the FLSA requires you to keep certain records related to employee time and pay, a very necessary precaution if there's ever an employee dispute and you have to defend yourself.
Thanks, Allison. I know that we covered everything really quickly, so I just want to remind everyone that you will receive on Friday an email that contains information about some of the products Allison just talked about and a recording of the presentation and the slides. So you'll be able to go back. If you had any questions about the overtime calculations or anything, you will be able to follow along with the recording. I know that we had a lot of information covered and we had a lot of very specific questions that came in. So Allison, I don't know, would you want to do some additional Q&A, and I can kind of give you some questions that we caught and see your thoughts on them.
That sounds great.
Great. Our first one comes from Mary Sue, and she asked, as a nonprofit organization, we have staff members that volunteer to work certain events not directly related to their specific job, but could be a fundraising event that the organization is holding. And I thought this would be helpful since you worked with a nonprofit. That's in your background. We don't consider this part of their work time. Is this reasonable?
There is a very narrow exception if what someone is doing is wildly different from their regular work. In general, an employee cannot volunteer for their employer, meaning doing work off the clock. There are some exceptions to that. If you think you might fall under one, I would say talk to a lawyer. But in general, as a general guideline, the safest thing that you can do is to pay people for all time worked, even if it's something like volunteering at an event.
Okay, I hope that helps, Mary Sue. I have another one from Sarah Beth, and she asked how much travel time should be paid for beyond. So if you're with a flight delay, you experience flight delay with all the snowstorms we've had this year, or driving to the airport, do you consider paying employees for this type of travel?
If they are non-exempt, you do need to pay for that type of travel. There are some rules, and again, I want to throw the caveat out here that I'm not a lawyer, and with any question like this, it's very helpful to talk to a lawyer who can take a look at the specifics of your situation. That said, there are some rules that, if someone is, say, traveling for a 12-hour period, you don't necessarily have to pay for the whole 12 hours. If they're free to do other work, for instance, if someone's on a plane and you're not requiring them to spend their time on the plane working, they can nap or they can read a book. In many cases, you do not have to consider that payable work time. But again, I'd urge you to take a look at the rules to consider how they apply to your situation in particular, because there's so much nuance to this.
Okay, that sounds good. Another question that we have from Greg, if it's okay with the employee, what's the problem with offering comp time instead of overtime pay?
Well, philosophically, Greg, I tend to agree with you. But what the law says is, and I can explain to you, I think, where the law is coming from on this. The law says comp time in lieu of pay is not acceptable. If someone is working, let's say, 50 hours in a week, and they would prefer to take those extra 10 hours as vacation next week, you can't do that. You have to pay them, and you have to pay them at the overtime rate for those extra 10 hours. The reason for that, I believe, is that if the law were not written that way, and it did allow comp time in lieu of overtime pay, we'd be opening things up to a situation where employers could place a lot of pressure on employees to accept comp time instead. The issue, of course, is that there's a power dynamic there. So an employer might say, well, look, Greg is volunteering for this. He actually prefers it this way. And maybe Greg does, but maybe Greg doesn't. And he's being pressured into saying that by his employer. So that's why the law is written the way that it is.
Next up, I have two good questions, and I'm going to combine them just because I think they can be easily covered and addressed in one. First question, I know non-exempt employees must be paid for their time worked, including short breaks, but what about smokers who take a handful of 10 to 15-minute breaks? It seems like an abuse of paid time. And then the follow-up to that is, would say you take 2 smoke breaks or 2 whatever personal breaks, are 2 15-minute breaks appropriate, or does each break have to be 30 minutes?
Got it. So it's a good question. First of all, the FLSA does not necessarily require breaks at all. Many state and local laws require breaks, and most employers will extend them regardless, just as a courtesy to their employees and a good management practice. Second, it's illegal to deduct for any breaks that are under 20 minutes. So what that leaves you with is drafting a policy on breaks. 2 15-minute breaks is pretty customary. But again, federal law has nothing to say on the subject. So it often depends on the nature of the work. Employees who work the telephones or on an assembly line. Your policy might say something like the company permits 2 paid breaks of 15 minutes each per workday. Any break that lasts longer than 20 minutes will be considered off-duty time for which you will not be compensated. And then you can enforce the policy through disciplinary measures if you need to. But because of state laws in many states that protect smokers from workplace discrimination, you want to make sure your policy applies to all personal breaks and doesn't single out smokers. But one thing that you want to be aware of, again, is that break time, the FLSA is pretty silent on the topic of whether or not you need to give breaks. So you want to look to your state law to figure out what is required of you in that regard. Some states don't require any breaks. Other states have very specific and complicated laws requiring breaks. So you really want to look it up for your own state.
We've got them rolling in. They keep rolling in, Allison. I have another one for you from Lori. What can an employer do if an exempt employee generally works 40 hours per week or less? Can the time worked less than 40, for example, if you have to take a doctor appointment or any personal appointments or phone calls, be required to be made up?
And that's for an exempt employee?
Yes.
So for an exempt employee, the law is very clear that you cannot dock their paychecks for a week, for instance, where they work less than 40 hours. You can dock their vacation pay. The law doesn't control at all how you handle vacation pay. So if you generally expect people to work a full 40 hours and someone takes 3 hours for vacation time, there's nothing stopping you from charging those 3 hours to their accrued vacation time. Now there is certainly a school of thought that I'd encourage you to think about with exempt employees that says, the whole point of being an exempt employee is that your employer isn't really tracking your time. You're expected to put in the time that it takes to get the job done. If you have exempt employees who are regularly working beyond 40 hours to get their job done, you can expect a pretty big hit to morale if you then start docking their vacation time on weeks where they have something like a doctor's appointment. So the law lets you do it, but you want to think about whether your employees are likely to perceive it as fair.
Okay. Got another one coming for you, Allison, from Victoria. Says you stated that uniforms are necessary for the job, and that changing is counted as time worked, which we covered earlier. If a uniform is required for the job, isn't it an employee's responsibility to make sure they are ready to work in uniform at their start time?
Absolutely. You can require workers to come to work already in that uniform. There are some jobs where that's not really practical, where changing into a uniform is probably going to happen once they arrive at work. If that is the case for you, then you would want to count that as time worked. But certainly, if you're in a restaurant, for instance, and you require all of your workers to wear black pants and a white shirt, there's no reason that you can't require people to show up at your workplace in that uniform and ready to work.
Okay, I hope that helps. Okay, so we have another question about paying younger workers that we don't have to pay younger workers the minimum wage, correct?
You want to be careful here. So there are certain exceptions for this, but you generally need to pay younger workers at least the federal minimum wage. The exceptions are a minimum wage of $4.25 an hour for workers who are under the age of 20, but only in their first 90 days of employment, and only if their work does not displace other employees. In other words, you can't lay off all of your workers over the age of 20 with the goal of hiring people who are 19 who you can pay less. And after 90 consecutive days or after the employee turns 20, whichever comes first, you do need to pay the current federal or state minimum wage, whichever is the higher of the two.
Okay. I hope that helps. I have another one from Kim. She wanted to know, and if you don't know this, Allison, maybe that's something that that they could consult legal counsel. But is there a regulation that is being considered where employees will be given the option to do comp time in lieu of overtime? There's been some thought leadership about this on the internet, and I didn't know if you had any thought about it, Allison?
Yeah, there has been talk about changing the law to allow employees to elect comp time instead of overtime. I don't know if there has been actual legislation introduced yet or if there will be legislation to that effect introduced. I think that you can expect it to be fought by labor unions if you see it come up, but certainly if that is a change that you would support, you should contact your legislators and you should encourage them to move the law in that direction. But yeah, it has, just in the last year, there's been more talk about doing that. And I think in part it's because there is a feeling among workers that plenty of people would like to choose comp time instead of overtime, and people are frustrated when the law says that they can't do it. Although going back to the question that we had earlier, I think it was from Greg, one of the reasons that protection is in place is because of the reality that many people worry that if the law were changed in that way, that employees would be pressured or even forced to choose comp time when that wasn't their preference.
Well, that's interesting. We'll all be on the lookout for any new regulation coming out. I know that we've always got our eyes and ears out on that landscape as well. We've got one more question from Jillian. What if a manager makes a change, such as the payroll system doesn't have an option for employees to acknowledge or approve that, but they need to make a time change? How do you make sure that it is compliant and meets all regulations?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing I'd say is make sure that the change you're making is accurate and make sure it is legal, meaning you can't dock someone's pay because they worked unauthorized overtime or whatever. So, but assuming that the change you're making is both accurate and legal, if your system doesn't have a built-in mechanism for demonstrating compliance, you have a lot of options on this. You can print something out and have the employee sign it and keep it as a note in their file. You can have them sign that particular time card. There's no prescribed one method that you have to use for doing it. It's just making sure you have some kind of documentation. Something like a signed memo is completely fine in a case like that.
Okay, I've got another question. How long do I have to retain records of employees no longer with the company?
So under the FLSA, as we talked about, you should retain them for 3 years. But you should also be aware there's some other laws that can be in play that have nothing to do with the FLSA at all. For instance, the law that prohibits age discrimination, I think, requires you to keep them slightly longer than that. So this is something where you'd want to look at the full landscape, not just FLSA.
Okay, that sounds good. I have another question for you. We've got so many questions. Thank you to everyone who is submitting everything. We're trying to get to as many as we can. And we do have time for a few more minutes, if that's okay with you, Allison, to cover more questions, just because we've received so many great ones.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay, good, great. I'm so excited. When an exempt employee is in a probationary period, can they be docked time for holidays if the policy says holiday pay is available after 90 days? So that's kind of a tricky one. So do you have any thoughts or starting points for this question?
Yeah, so the fact that they are in a probationary period has no bearing whatsoever on what's required under FLSA. It doesn't change an employer's obligations at all. Let's see, for an exempt employee, you would not be able to dock a holiday even if they didn't work that day, because one of the tests for whether or not someone can be treated as exempt is whether they're receiving the same weekly salary pay period after pay period, regardless of the hours they worked.
Let's go specific into maybe different industries. I know you're primarily nonprofit. If we were in the education world and there was a teacher who works 40 hours a week but took home papers to grade, what would you suggest to do in that scenario? Is that covered?
Teachers are generally going to be exempt. So unfortunately for teachers, the number of additional hours they're working wouldn't trigger the overtime pay requirement. If you had a teacher who for some reason was in a role that was non-exempt, and I don't know enough about the education field to say exactly what that would be, but maybe something like a teacher's assistant could possibly qualify as non-exempt. In a situation like that, where you have a non-exempt employee, taking work home to do at night would indeed be work that has to be paid.
Okay, well, I hope that helps. I think that was Mary that asked that question. So Mary, I hope that question and answer helps you. Our next question came in from Christina. Basically, I'll try to paraphrase it, but if you have specific start and end times during your day, do you need to, on the timesheet, specify the starting hour and the ending hour, or can you summarize it into a total of 8 hours?
So you theoretically can do either. It's probably not going to cause an issue for you if you just record the number of hours worked. It is safer, however, to record when you started and when you stopped. And the reason that I say that is if down the road there's some sort of dispute over the number of hours that this person was paid for, the more precise your documentation, the better. You know, if you just have a piece of paper that says 8 hours this day and 7 hours this day, and the employee herself has more detailed record keeping that says the time she came in and the time she left and her breaks, her records are going to be a lot more credible and compelling than yours. So in general, if you want to be as safe as possible, I would use the more detailed method of really noting when the day started and when it stopped.
Okay, I hope that helps all of you in your record keeping for timesheets in the future. And if you have any questions again about what we've talked about today, or you wanted us to repeat anything, it will all be sent to you in an email. We'll send you on Friday an email report with our recording from today and our presentation slides. So you'll be able to catch back up if anything, you know, oh, that was a great note, I didn't write that down. You'll be able to catch that on Friday and get anything that you've missed. Allison, we have another great question from Sandra. How can an exempt employee be placed on suspension without pay?
So the law says that if you have an exempt employee who does any work at all within a given work week, even if it's just a couple hours, they have to be paid their full salary for that week. However, if they don't do any work during that week, then you have an exception to that. So if you were placing someone on on suspension without pay, you'd want to look at doing it for a full week period.
Okay, I hope that helps, Sandra. We have time for one final question, so I'm just making sure that we find something that we can talk about. Okay, so this is from Christine. Can exempt salary employees take comp time hour for hour? Does it have to be consistent for all exempt employees? Can you shed any light on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So exempt employees are quite literally exempt from the FLSA. So everything that we've talked about with the FLSA does not apply to them, and that is literally what exempt employees are exempt from. So yes, you can absolutely give comp time to exempt employees. You're not required to, but you can choose to do it as a management policy. You can choose to do it 1 hour for 1 hour. You can choose some other formula. The law is totally silent on that, and it's up to you. The second part of that question, do you need to do it, can you do it differently for one exempt employee than another? In theory, yes. The thing that you want to watch out for is, in general, it's wise to treat similarly situated employees the same as others. What that means is if you have, you want to treat all your senior managers the same way, but you might treat, say, all your administrative employees a different way. You might treat all your junior level employees a different way. The reason that's important is that if you are ever facing allegations of some form of illegal discrimination, if you have an employee who says, I was discriminated based on my race or my gender or my religion, you don't want them to be able to point to that kind of differing treatment as evidence of it. You don't want someone to be able to say, well, someone in a different racial category or religious category or someone of a different gender was given significantly more comp time for the same amount of work as me. You want to treat, you can avoid that happening if you ensure that you're treating similarly situated employees basically the same.
Okay, I think that wraps it up. Now, I do want to thank everyone for attending. Allison, thank you so much for spending the hour with us and talking about the 5 common FLSA mistakes to avoid. I hope everyone learned a few things about record keeping for timesheets and everything else to make sure that you comply with FLSA law. If you found this presentation today useful, I would like to invite you to attend our April webinar, and we will be partnering with Robin Schooling again, if you remember her from our past presentations, and we will be talking about onboarding. So as you know, it kind of goes beyond printing badges and setting up email. Onboarding is crucial to your business as it's important to welcome a new employee to your organization and make sure they're dedicated beyond just a couple months when they're a new hire. So once you receive the follow-up email from us on Friday, you'll also receive a link to register to our April webinar. And again, that is April 8th, 2015 with Robin Schooling. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. Again, finally, don't forget, you'll receive your email on Friday with a follow-up presentation with the slides, the recording, everything you need. And when this presentation ends, you'll also be taken to a post-meeting survey where you can provide your feedback to us and let us know what you would like to learn more about with this HR Direct webinar series. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.